Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next session here in the ABARES Outlook conference. This one is one for the water nerds as we look into some water trading issues in the Murray-Darling Basin. My name is Warwick Long. I am the Country Hour presenter for the Victorian Country Hour based in Shepparton in the southern Murray-Darling Basin. And it's my great pleasure to be with you to talk through some particularly interesting water trading issues in the basin. It's quite specific this year, and I think it could be very valuable to you. So we'll go through that. Before we get started, though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting today. And I realise for everybody, since you're dialing in from Australia or in the world, it may be different wherever you are. For me, where I am in Shepparton, it's the Yorta Yorta people that I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging today. Let's begin our session today looking at benefits of water trade in the basin and how markets could be improved with the Australian Minister for Water, the Honourable Keith Pitt, with his address to you today. Take it away.
It's great to join you today for the 2022 ABARES Outlook Conference Water Markets session. This year's conference theme, Growing Agriculture Through Innovation and Sustainability, could not be more important given the unprecedented events of recent years. Our regional communities and businesses have been put to the test by drought, COVID-19 and recent floods. The significant flooding, together with the rain, resulted in downgrading and loss of crops for some farmers who were looking to build on good harvests in 2020 and 21. In the coming session, you will embark on an important discussion about a key part of Australia's water policy framework, the benefits of water trade in the Murray-Darling Basin, and how markets could be improved. This is a live discussion for communities right across the basin, and it's one I've had with many people since being appointed Water Minister in early 2020. Water markets give farmers a critical tool to maximise the value of their production. Farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin produce about 40% of Australia's food and fibre, and about 9,200 of those farms use irrigation to maximise production. Water markets have grown rapidly over the past 20 years. What started as trading the odd megalitre with a neighbour has become a sector with an annual turnover of about $7 billion. Today, Australia is recognised as a global leader in water markets. It's because we continue to evolve, we innovate, and at times we reform. Our government is committed to making sure Murray-Darling Basin water markets are fair, are transparent, are efficient and future-proof. That's why I appointed Mr Darryl Quinn-Liven as Principal Advisor to the Australian Government on water market reform. While we're enjoying better conditions now, the drought conditions that gave rise to the ACCC inquiry into water markets will inevitably return. That inquiry reported in March last year. While it did not find any evidence of market misconduct, the ACCC made a series of recommendations to improve water market regulation and operations. Now, Darryl is looking at those recommendations carefully and talking with basin states, industry and other stakeholders to develop a phased, practical and cost-effective roadmap for water market reform. He's worked with the basin states to deliver his initial December advice on early actions agreed with basin governments. It's published on the department's website. I encourage everyone to take the time to read it. For example, the initial advice explores how a mandatory code of conduct for water market intermediaries could be implemented and how information within the water market can be improved to meet stakeholder needs. I look forward to receiving Darryl's final advice on the practical reforms that can be implemented to improve water markets for all users without adding unnecessary cost burdens. I also extend my thanks to Basin State Ministers and their officials for such constructive engagement. Fair water markets rely on a strong compliance regime. Now, our government answered the call from basin communities, establishing the independent office of the Inspector General of Water Compliance and appointing the Honourable Troy Grant to the statutory role. As the Inspector General, Mr Grant delivers confidence to basin communities that rules around how water is shared are fit for purpose and being applied consistently. The office is monitoring Commonwealth and basin state agencies. We're making sure no one is marking their own homework when it comes to water resource management. These are a few of the practical steps that our government is taking to make sure water markets are fit for purpose and can support Australian agriculture grow into a $100 billion sector by 2030. I wish you well with the panel discussion. I look forward to hearing the outcomes of the session. Discussions like these are important in bringing the voices of those affected by reforms and those with the most experience of the system into the national conversation. Our government is committed to keeping communities at the heart of policy and program implementation so that changes we make improve the lives and livelihoods of the millions of Australians who rely on the Murray-Darling Basin every single day. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That is the Federal Water Minister, Keith Pitt, taking you through his address here on this ABARES panel, looking at the benefits of water trade in the basin. So let's set the scene with some of the work from ABARES now and have a look at their work looking into water markets and trade and how it's working. Senior economist at ABARES, Mihir Gupta, can take you through a lot of that work now, and then we'll be back with a panel session. You can put your questions in and start voting on which questions you want to hear about, and we'll go through those after this video with our panel. But before that, here's Mihir Gupta from ABARES.
Time and time again, research has shown that water markets provide benefits to irrigators and are vital to the future of the Murray-Darling Basin. One of the key features of markets in the southern Murray-Darling Basin is the ability to trade water between regions. Interregional trade offers many benefits for irrigators and is now a crucial tool that helps them adapt to changing seasonal conditions. However, structural changes in recent years have pushed markets to their physical and administrative limits. The recent ACCC inquiry into water markets made a number of recommendations to enhance markets, one of which focused on interregional trade mechanisms, which will be the focus of today's panel session. The Southern Basin water allocation market is one of the most advanced in the world, facilitating the movement of water between users and across vast distances. Trading water on the market provides numerous benefits to irrigators in this region. By trading water, irrigators have the option to supplement their supply based on their needs. Water trade even provides additional income to irrigators, as they can sell their water if the price is greater than the profit they could generate by using that water to grow crops. For example, when conditions are dry and prices are high, rice growers in the Murrumbidgee could generate a higher return by selling their water instead of using it to grow rice. Conversely, irrigators in the horticultural sector in the Vic Murray rely on markets to ensure they have the water they need to prevent the death of their trees in dry years. Recent ABARES modelling found that interregional trade alone provides around $127 million in economic benefits on average each year. But while the benefits generated by trade are substantial, structural changes over time have placed markets under significant pressure and revealed some weaknesses. Over the last decade, there have been reductions in water supply due to climate change, drought, and water recovered for the environment. There have also been increases in water demand, particularly with expansions in the horticultural sector. In 2018, dry conditions and rising prices triggered concerns about the operations and efficiency of water markets, prompting the government to direct the ACCC to conduct an in-depth review of water markets in the Murray-Darling Basin. This ACCC report was released in 2021 and made 29 recommendations for market reform. The focus of today's panel session is on one particular recommendation to improve intervalley trade mechanisms. As the ACCC noted, there were significant deficiencies in current water trading arrangements. So to manage trade between regions in the Southern Basin, we currently rely on a system of intervalley trade limits. This system is designed to recognize one of the fundamental challenges of water markets, which is that water is a physical commodity that takes time to flow between regions. But of course, water trade happens instantaneously, so over time, the volume of water owed between regions can accumulate. To ensure that each valley does not lose water because of trade, river operators keep track of the total trade balance and close trade when this balance gets too high or too low. With the demand for trade increasing over the past 2 decades, this IVT system has struggled to keep up. As a result, trade closures have become more frequent, leading to price gaps between regions. For example, we can see here that the average monthly price in the Goulburn has typically been lower than the price in the Vic Murray since around 2017. These price gaps do lead to inefficient outcomes because irrigators in the Goulburn could generate a higher income by selling their water, and irrigators in the Murray could use that water to increase their crop production. The truth is, when markets were first formally established, no one expected the volume and frequency of trade that occurs today. As markets have matured, a lot more water has moved between regions, and not just in dry years. But as you can see in this chart, this has meant that trade closures have also become much more frequent and long-lasting. This is of course bad for irrigators, since they are now much more reliant on water trade to manage their water supply and their needs. Since markets are essentially closed when trade limits are binding, the current system also greatly limits the information available to river operators, who essentially have to manage river systems without any knowledge of the actual demand for water trade. For the sake of illustration, if we think of markets and river operators as two broad entities, then under the current system there are two types of relationships that exist between these entities. When IVTs are open, the market leads the river operators. Transactions accumulate in the market and dictate how much water the river operators have to move between regions. When these balances get too high, IVTs close and this relationship changes. When IVTs are closed, river operators lead the market. They decide when and how much water can be moved between regions, taking into account delivery losses and their existing commitments to deliver water. The problem with this approach, though, is that it creates a lot of uncertainty for irrigators. They don't know when, where, and how much of the trade opportunity is going to be made available to them. So ABARES has attempted to identify the root issues at play here. Now, these are by no means definitive, but they could be useful as a guide to alternative approaches. So first off, the ACCC identified issues with the fairness of access to trade opportunities under the current system. When trade limits are binding, if an opportunity to trade is made available, those who are fastest to process their trades get all the benefits. Secondly, the current system struggles to deal with this disconnect between the time it takes to process a trade and the time it takes to move water between regions. At the moment when a trade occurs, accounts are credited and debited immediately, leaving river operators to constantly play catch-up, trying to manage the delivery of this traded water. And thirdly, under the current system, we never really attempted to determine the right amount of trade. This is, of course, an incredibly difficult thing to do. However, because river operators are constantly reacting to markets under the current system, their primary consideration becomes the hydrological factors at play and managing the risk of losses associated with delivering water between regions. Now, these are all well-known issues with water markets in the Southern Basin. The ACCC received a number of submissions with ideas for market reform, including one that ABARES made with a new approach to trade, one that is proactive and predictable. So under this new approach, a decision-making entity would simultaneously make decisions for both water trade and river operations. This entity would consider the environmental, economic, and hydrological conditions each month and use this information to make periodic, scheduled announcements for the volume of trade, for example, on the first of each month. This approach would make water markets much more predictable, with trade occurring on a fixed schedule rather than opening and closing for random intervals. There are a variety of mechanisms you could use to distribute the trade opportunities, such as ballots, auctions, trading rights, proportion rights, and so on. And these will be discussed further in today's panel session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mihir Gupta there from ABARES, setting the scene and getting us warmed up for our session today. Let's move into the panel session now here on this ABARES session looking at water trade in the basin. And there's a lot to digest there and a lot to jump into. And I'm conscious of time too. We only have the hour to jump into it. So we'll bring each guest up and ask them a question, really setting the scene on their involvement here and where they're coming from. And then we'll jump right into questions as well. So first up, let's have Joe Banks from DELP, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Victoria. He's the Acting Director of Water Markets and Grid. And as you heard there, one of the big examples, Joe, was the Goulburn Valley situation and the Intervalley trade from the Goulburn Valley there, and how many days a year that river system is closed to trade to the rest of the Murray-Darling Basin. So can you start us off by talking about the Victorian government's work in this area and what's being looked at in terms of either opening up IVT or managing it in a different way?
Yeah, thanks, Warwick. Thanks for having me, because I think this is a really it's a really important topic and really interesting and lots of things to talk about. And look, as you mentioned, in Victoria, we have been doing some work on reviewing the Goulburn to Murray trade limit, which is one of the key intervalley trade limits in the Southern Connected Basin, and looking at, I guess, some of the themes behind these core questions. So at heart, we're really trying to take a step back and have a look at how much trade is possible from the Goulburn to the Murray system within the environmental tolerances of the Goulburn system and within the capacity to supply that traded water into the Murray system further downstream and without creating unacceptable impacts on other people in the Murray. And we've really learnt a lot through the process, I think, and it's opened up some of these other questions as well about how trade rules work and how trade opportunities open and how people in the market have access to those trade opportunities. And maybe even more importantly, how people understand how it's going to work so they can make informed decisions around that. So I'm hoping that'll form a useful part of today's discussion, not the whole lot, but I think it really opens up a lot of what we're talking about today.
I think you've got a lot of doors there that we can walk through. We'll do our best to go through a few of them today. We might bring in Neil Hughes here from ABARES as well, because we just heard from Mihir, Neil, too, talking about how, well, some of the ideas around mechanisms that could be used in this space to make trade a little bit easier. Hearing the examples of what the Victorian government's looking at and considering some of ABARES' work, what are some of those mechanisms and how could they work in the basin?
Yeah, thanks, Warwick. Yeah, so I think, it's great that the states are looking into this and already trying to make some changes. And Victoria, with their Goulburn IVT, they're definitely trying to come up with a system that's a little bit more predictable to users. And there's also work going on with Murrumbidgee IVT as well. I guess at ABARES, we're thinking a little bit further ahead, and we're kind of thinking about how we could take things even further over the longer term. And make some more fundamental changes to how interregional trade works. I think, as Mihir kind of introduced, I think that the fundamental problem has been this disconnect between river operations, so the physical movement of water, and the operation of markets. Historically, been somewhat separate from river operations, and the job of the river operators was just to kind of observe the market and try to accommodate it within their plans. But I think it's become increasingly obvious that as the volumes of trade have grown, that approach is no longer sustainable. We have this unfortunate situation where the IVT limits are kind of turning on and off all the time, and they're off most of the time. So we think that this problem is kind of not unique to water. It's similar to other problems that are faced in electricity markets, which is how do you simultaneously take into account the operational side of things and the market. And the basic idea is that you kind of need to put that decision in the hands of a single decision maker. So we need an entity like the river operator to be thinking not just about river operations and hydrology, but also about trade volumes and potentially setting those trade volumes on a regular basis. It seems that we are, this problem's not going to go away anytime soon, that the pressure for trade is likely to exceed the capacity of the river to deliver it for some time ahead. And we're never going to go back to a situation where people can trade as much water as they want. So we need to make some tough decisions about how much trade should be allowed. And I think the best thing we can do is put that decision in the hands of an entity that's accountable and has to take into account the environmental, the hydrology, and the economic all together at one time.
And that's probably the perfect place to go to Rachel Kelly, who's irrigator, lawyer, rural leadership graduate, advocate, spent a lot of time around the Murray and Murrumbidgee valleys, particularly in the areas of rice growers, but also with New South Wales irrigators. Rachel, you hear Neil say something like the demand for trade is going to be more than the capacity for the river to deliver it for some time yet. How do you feel irrigators are sitting in this space at the moment? Are you getting the information and the signals you need to be able to work in this area and make good business decisions?
Thanks, Warwick, and thanks to ABARES for having me. I think that it's been well known both at the state level in New South Wales, where I sit, and also at the MDBA level, that the current system of IBT arrangements isn't perfect, and that there is definitely room for improvement. And Neil's right. With increasing irrigation development, climate change, good commodity prices, and so on, there's going to be increasing pressure on the IBT systems, and that's, as Mihir said, likely to lead to, if the current systems stay in place, likely to lead to those limits closing more regularly, as has been the case leading up to now. From a user perspective, I think that whatever reform we're looking at, it really needs to be user-friendly, and we need to look at how can we make those systems more equitable for those on the ground. And while it's having full equality is probably never going to be achieved, potentially there's better arrangements for how we access the IVT at the moment as an irrigator that need to be considered carefully. And so New South Wales is currently looking at its IVT system. There's a review being undertaken at the moment. We're a bit behind Victoria and the Goulburn system, but those things have been put under the spotlight both through the ACCC review and also through what New South Wales, the department, is doing at the moment.
Can I just follow up quickly with you, if I may, when you're saying how changes you'd like them to see them to, just to make sure for the end user they're more equitable. Do they not feel? Does the system not feel equitable to irrigators at the moment, or do you just think things could be better?
I think there's room for things to be better. So one of the through the rice industry, through my role with the rice industry, when we were doing our submissions to the ACCC review, and both the initial paper and the final paper, we did a survey of stakeholders, and the key one of the key things that come out of that is that people felt that they didn't have the opportunity to access the IVT trade in their own right, and they were reliant on brokers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But they also felt that there was a handful of people or a handful of entities that were using that IVT opportunity because they had better systems to access that opportunity, which the general grassroots irrigator didn't have access to. So there's an equity issue there if people are potentially using systems that aren't easily accessed by the regular user.
Thank you for that. And I'll put a pin in that because I think we might talk about especially the equipment that's used around managing IVTs and who has access and who doesn't in just a moment. Let's bring in Tom Rooney here, 33 odd years of experience in the water industry, CEO of and founder of the Waterfind group, which includes technology stuff as well as water broking systems. But Tom, we heard from Joe talk about some of the work being done in the Goulburn there. We heard from Neil being talked about some of the sort of the pie in the sky ideas for the future. I'd love to hear from you the idea of a water broker with changes to water availability and movement between valleys. When a decision like that is made, how does it affect your business? For example, how have the restrictions from the Goulburn of trade affected water broking?
Yeah, thanks, Warwick. It's been an interesting ride through the development of IVT accounts. So first of all, there was no trade, then there was the tradability. Then we saw a series of pilots, interstate pilots and intervalley pilots. Initially, there was no limits. If we take, for instance, the Goulburn IVT, there was no limits on trading out of that district into the Murray system up to 2012. And in 2012, then we actually got our 200 gigalitre limit, and we've been trialling a potential new IVT structure this season. How does it affect this business? I'd say it makes things very chaotic for a small period of time. As customers of ours want to utilise our services to help get their water out of the district and into another market. And generally, the major driver of that is value in a temporary market space. And you know, we often see a $20 to $30 per megalitre in a year like this year, which is accounting for probably about a 30% value differential between what would be classified as a lower liquidity market or demand market to a higher liquidity market. So people are often wanting to get their water out. Sometimes they want to get their water out just to have more valuable water. Sometimes they want to get their water out to actually shift it to a farm. So it gets fairly busy for a very short, intense period of time. We have to organise our teams to get in early and often sort of have the finger over a series of refresh screens that the department are using. So we generally get a team of 2 or 3 people that start at 6 a.m. in the morning, preparing everything, ready to go, and then we start lodging. So, and sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. So a bit of a luck of the draw. Well, not just the luck of the draw, it's also, you know, we've got to be fairly organised. We've gone through a series of different ways in which these are managed through ballots, through first in time, first in right, through what we call rollovers or resets as far as volumetric limits. So we've seen a number of different ways in which these have operated. And the big question I'd have is with the ACCC is the ACCC in recommendation, I think it was 22, said that they did want to improve these intervalley, you know, trading restrictions or transparency. I'd say, do they want to improve it? Do they want to expand it? Do they want to improve it and contract it? Or do they want to just improve it? Because what we've seen in some of these areas is actually a contraction and a series of little things that can have really big impacts in relation to how much water is available to be trading. Now, I think I would like to take the determination of what the ACCC said, but this is my own personal view, that improving intervalley trade limits means expanding it, testing our ability for a region to deliver water to another region so we can have more tradability. And but that's just a trade, you know, that's just a water broker's view of the world. That's and it might not be the view that's shared with everyone else.
I, for one, am shocked that a water broker wants more trade, Tom Rooney, but thank you. Thank you very much for providing that today, and we will examine that more. And actually, I think a lot of the discussion from you and Rachel flows really nicely into the question that is up at the moment, which I'll read to you now. In a market where intervalley trade is often restricted due to binding limits when a trade opportunity becomes available, it's often captured by a small number of sophisticated market participants. How do we make trade more accessible and fairer / equitable? It comes to a little bit of what Rachel was saying before. It also, it comes to the idea of those with the better technology being first in line for trade when it does open up under the current system. Neil Hughes from ABARES, I might get you to talk on this first. Can you explain, am I sort of on the right track in interpreting this question? Like, how does technology and the sophisticated market participants influence the intervalley trade system as it currently stands?
Can you, yeah, sorry. It's been a common problem that it's been raised throughout the ACCC inquiry, and as long as we've been stuck in this situation where the IVT limits are only opening for very brief periods. So we have pretty persistent, in some cases, large differences in prices between regions. So as you can imagine, the farmers and the water market participants in the low price region are very keen to sell their water into the high price region at any opportunity. But there's a limited amount of trade that can happen. At the moment, that's being rationed on a first in, best dressed basis. So whoever gets their paperwork in the door first to the state government, gets their trade processed, and they capture the gains from trade. So this is, if you look at the way the states have been tackling this issue, so Victoria, with as Joe was talking about before, they're focused a bit more on the predictability about how much trade is going to happen and when it's going to be open or closed. In New South Wales, I think the focus of their consultation in the Murrumbidgee has been very much this question about, who's getting the benefits. When trade is open, is it just the fastest who can make that money? So the idea that ABARES has been putting forward, and there was a similar option that was floated in the Murrumbidgee IVT discussion paper, was around a proportional trading pool. So there are examples of this in other regions in the basin and also overseas. And the basic idea would be that you ask for expressions of interest for people who want to trade. When you have more people wanting to trade than you have capacity to trade, you ration that on some kind of pro rata basis so that everyone gets a share in the gains from trade, and they're not kind of not all accruing just the first person through the door, so to speak.
Joe, do you want to jump in on that? Do you want to sort of talk? Is this something Victoria's cognizant of, and sort of what are your thoughts, or does the state's work in with what Neil's talking about there?
Yeah, look, I think as Neil said, we're primarily focused on, through the Goulburn to Murray trade rule, how much trade opportunity is possible, and also, as Neil mentioned, when and how that's made available. So I think people understanding when it's available is a big part of being able to have a fair go at the access to the opportunity. And then lastly, I think this core question is about once it's available, how do you manage who gets a go? We think that's really a pretty tricky question, and it's been bouncing around for quite a long time. So we still work on a system where the first process gets approved, and really the historic rationale for that is you get a yes or no answer at the time. You don't get a part answer. You don't have to wait around for the end of a ballot, etc. So there's always been those offsets and challenges on the other side. It's got a lot more focus now, particularly seeing as it happens so fast. And I think these questions about technology are important. At the end of the day, to us, I think still ultimately the first question is, does everyone have the chance to use their technology and get their trade in the queue? And maybe, as Rachel mentioned as well, we're in a world where people use intermediaries and brokers more and more often to get them access to those services. Are those brokers giving everyone a fair go kind of thing? How do people have confidence that their trade is getting a fair go, either directly submitted or through the broker? So I do think this is a really important question, and there's a lot of public interest in it. I'm not sure the answer is that easy, but I think it is something we're going to be talking about for a while. And at the end of the day, we need to get to a point where people have confidence that they have an avenue to get their trade to have a fair go, however they choose to.
Oh, I'm disappointed you can't solve it in an hour for ABARES, Joe, but that's okay. Rachel, actually, just on what Joe was saying, there's a question that's come through for you too, saying what effect does this uncertainty around trade opportunities have on irrigators? Do you think irrigators are essentially forced to rely on brokers? And I suppose that goes a little bit to what you were saying before. Does it make it more difficult for an irrigator to understand when and where they can trade and how much money they could make?
Yeah, Warwick, I think that, and some of the evidence that we got from our rice grower community when we did our survey for the ACCC review was that a majority of growers did feel that they had, that in order to access the IVT's trade opportunity, they had to use a broker. And using a broker, as I said before, I don't think using a broker is necessarily a bad thing. If you're going to access the stock market, you need to use really some form of an intermediary. But we need to have, first of all, we need to have integrity in our broker system, and that's something that even the Brokers Association said to the ACCC through that review process. So that's number one. But also, I think what Joe is saying is the same for New South Wales, that we need to look at whether or not there are other options for providing access to the IVT. And so I guess similar to Victoria, some of the key things that have been discussed, and as Neil said, is having some kind of pro rata system, potentially with a base level of trade, to ensure we're not giving people 1 or 2 megalitres of trade across the system. I know the ACCC's talked about an auction system. The ABARES, has talked about an auction system. I think there's pros and cons to that. It might be a difficult thing to consider, but they are probably the key things that are floating around at the moment. On top of all that, we need the information to be communicated in a way that's easily accessible by irrigators. So I know for us at the moment, it's through the Water New South Wales website. You've got to sort of check every morning whether or not the amount of water is being delivered or the trade opportunity is likely to come up soon. For people who are busy doing harvest or milking cows or whatever they're doing, that can be a difficult thing to get onto the computer or get onto your phone every morning and check that at the right time. So I think, yes, for the everyday irrigator, it's probably difficult to be able to make the most of that opportunity without using a broker.
There we go. I'm conscious of time, but and I do want to move on to some slightly different topics, but I did love this one, and it has been thumbs up 3 times, which is good enough for me. And it's for you, Tom Rooney. And why I love it is it takes me behind the curtain. It says, as a broker, how do you deal with the unpredictability of trade opportunities? What gives you advantages? How do you get the best outcomes for your clients? Take us behind the curtain of water broking over the last few decades. How did you get those little advantages where your company or your clients could get through an IVT and others may not have been able to?
So thanks, Warwick. Over the years, really through trial and error, tripping up, skinning your knees, working out what works, what doesn't work over many, many years, and then developing a series of systems and processes around it and enshrining those systems and processes into some sort of quality assurance system. So we have, we're the only market operator in the world actually that's quality assured, and we do that to actually enshrine some of these systems because it provides us with a good independent check about the systems and processes that we've learnt and developed, because at some stage they'll stick me in a pine box, and that intelligence needs to keep on moving. It needs to keep on moving through an organisation, and we do that through our quality assurance system. So behind the curtain, it's tricky for a broker even, because the first in time, first in right basis, you even need to have a priority basis within your own business. Now those systems and processes have fared us very well and fared our clients very well. We get a very high guarantee, we get a very high percentage of trades approved. But even within that, we still have a ranking that we develop internally. Because you can't win first in time, first in right, we have got a limited amount of mouses and people's fingers to press buttons on to lodge transactions, right? So, and within that, we have a team that's doing that, and we have our own internal priority. Now, we're talking seconds, like in a cluster, right? You go, you go, you go, you go, you go. And this is based upon what we call our intermediary agreements. So we actually time our engagements that we get from people, and when they engage us, we time it, and we actually lodge based upon the timed engagement. And even doing of our services, and even doing that, we're talking a matter of seconds or part of seconds of lodgements. We have to set our own internal sort of what we classify as fairness about. So then, do you do this with the, who's the biggest transaction, who's the first one to provide, who pays you the most money to do things? So we've sort of gone with first in time, first in right as far as engagement is concerned. So it's a series of systems. Those systems are developed through trial and error. We enshrine those systems in quality assurance, and we have a series of daily checks that provide us with some intelligence about when an opening might be occurring and likely to be occurring. And this is where we start then looking maybe several times during a day, and because about when we think an IVT might be coming in. So we have developed our own internal mechanisms to forecast when an IVT will come in, so we can prepare ourselves and prepare our clients to be ready.
I love the idea of an army of Waterfind workers that with their mouse clicks at the ready, you literally to try and get it when things open. That's literally the case, that you're all sitting there ready to go.
Yeah, they come in early. There's a team.
And that would be similar at other water broker offices around.
I think so. Yeah. Yep. And
thank you.
We're refreshing screens on the department website, waiting for the little green arrow to come up or it's open, and away we go.
Well, I did ask to go behind the curtain and you took us there. So thank you very much for that, Tom. Let's move to a slightly different issue. This next question's got a number of thumbs up next to it. And it's really about how the system operates itself. We're obviously talking about the economics here and the ability to move water from one place to the other. But there's also the losses and the running of the system to go with it as well. And this question sort of gets towards that. It says, is part of the problem here that losses associated with delivering water is not something that people think about when trading water? And as a result, are river operation decisions too focused on managing those losses? Joe, can I swing to you first maybe on this one? Because the original reason for restrictions on Goulburn trade was due to a lot of environmental concerns at the time. Is this something that you have to be cognizant of in terms of the amount of water that's can physically move when you're setting these rules and limits, and things like the losses associated with that if it's going to be traded further downstream?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of the factors that has to be considered. I would say this is one of the things that can result in third-party impacts to other people associated with trade. So losses gets raised a bit, but really the way we think about it through the Goulburn to Murray is how much trade is possible, how much can be delivered, and once the trade has happened, what are your options for how you manage supply to where the traded water is being used over the course of the year? And in doing that, will that create unacceptably higher losses than existed before? So I think it is a bit of a threshold test. It does get raised a bit, but it doesn't get thought about. But I think in our Goulburn to Murray example, we are taking a step back and looking at what those bigger picture changes of what the movement of using water in one place to another will be, what that means where you supply it from, and on balance, how much loss will that cause? I guess that's an example of how we think about it as a connected system and try to build that threshold into a single rule. I think there is another school of thought, I think, where perhaps the individual people who do the trade should have their water delivered directly and should be individually accountable for those losses. I think the trade-off that's always been thought about there is the complexity of managing each person's individual trade as a discrete bucket of water to make it really precise, or the benefits of aggregating it up into an on-balance system rule. So certainly we're doing a lot in the latter in the current Goulburn to Murray trade rule. Is it as precise about the losses if you're doing it individually? I'm not sure, but there's some of the real things we have to think through about, a simple average rule versus something that's very specific to an individual, but an individual might have to understand quite a few things.
I'd love to be able to be mixing it a little bit more about who I'm going to and when, but it feels like we fall into this order of getting the theory behind it and then jumping into the irrigator and business response. But Neil, I do want to come to you on this, Neil Hughes from ABARES, just in terms of the idea of talking about losses when delivering water and how the rules are set. Is there a different way we could be talking about? They're picking up some of Mihir's work from his presentation earlier. Are we talking about a more centralised approach to trade than what we've currently got? Can you go explain sort of some of the ideas behind that?
Yeah, I think losses is a really important one. You only have to look at the concerns of some of the irrigators during the recent drought, the class action that was brought against the Murray-Darling Basin river operators. So there's a lot of people very worried about the amount of water that's getting sent downstream and the losses associated with that. And it gets to what Tom was talking a bit about before, about from his perspective, he would like more trade. And, obviously we could have a system where trade is completely open and we let people trade whatever volumes they want and the prices would equalise. But naturally, that would potentially increase losses. We'd have very large volumes going downstream, potentially going to have third-party effects and people upstream that are not too happy about that. It's quite difficult to make the market think about losses, so to factor the losses into trade rules through things like exchange rates or loss factors, because the way the river works is very complicated. The losses vary a lot depending on the season, month or day that you're talking about. So we think that the approach that we've been outlining could have some advantages in terms of making it easier to account for losses by going through on a regular schedule, say monthly, and trying to align the volumes of water that are physically moving with the trade flows. It would make it easier to make an assessment about the losses that are applying each month and to apply those to the market, so that potentially, if you're selling water out of the Murrumbidgee or the Goulburn and only 90 or 80% of that actually gets to the Murray, that the market transaction kind of factors that loss factor in, and therefore you're not going to have third-party effects that people would understandably get annoyed about.
Can I just get a clarification on that then? So if there was a centralised sort of model, say you bought a megalitre of water, but you were operating a farm well down the river system, do you get then 0.9 of a megalitre delivered because it's accounting for the losses? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea that you want to head to. It's not unprecedented. We have systems like that in place around Australia, in some cases, loss factors, but it is very hard because, like I said, it's generally hard to know what that number should be. A lot of the time, it's zero, in the sense that what any one irrigator does has no effect on the river. The river operations is kind of set, and if your trade volumes are small, you're not changing anything. But in some cases, they can be significant. And I think what we're talking about is having a flexible approach, so that on a regular basis, monthly, we can kind of make judgment calls about these things and factor them in.
Keep moving. And Tom, I might bring you in here, just even on that idea, but mainly there's a question here that I think relates to this, saying there's a lot of bickering due to the competing interests of residents and governments involved in and along the Murray-Darling Basin. Is it time for the Commonwealth to step in and establish a reasonable one? Okay. If there was a one-stop shop for trade rules and trade, would that help?
Yes, got it. Yeah, it would. And this is doable. I mean, there is zones. We do have identified zones within the area, and there is already exchange rate systems in place. And a lot of those exchange rate systems are one-for-one, as Neil was talking about. But in some, transferring out of an unregulated, what they call an unregulated system, into a regulated system in Victoria, for instance, there are exchange rates. You can either make water or lose water. And this is doable through a smart algorithm. Obviously, your losses are more during dry times than they are during wet times, because if you've got a full system, you put a drop of water here, and you can take a drop of water out there, it just automatically balances itself. But in a drier system, that's and you can pre-calculate that into an algorithm. There is good attempts from many state governments to work together to have a variety of different rules that do work together. And the question there is, are we better off having a centralised authority that would do that rather than a series of states? It is really difficult for us to unwind the control of states in water, because it's in our constitution, right? So the states sort of vehemently fought around water and rail in our constitutional debates, and they won water, and they won the control of water, and it was a state-based resource. There is the new Water Ombudsman now that is part of the Murray-Darling Basin Act, an extension to that, an amendment of that. There could be something that they could do through that. I think the trial of exchange rates, Mihir or Neil talked about do you develop a market license for some of these abilities through some sort of right? We've trialled ballots, we've trialled first in time. I think they've got some issues associated with equity, particularly when it comes to farmers and people accessing the market. People need to move too quickly, too fast, and I think there could be better ways for us to do this through exchange rates or through some sort of licensing structure where people actually buy a right to get or to compete for a right, which is offered by the authority or whoever that is. So I'm a centralised authority could help. There's no doubt about that. But also states being funded, and also states being encouraged to do some further work together to expand and work on common projects to really test some of these limits that we've put in place. Some of them have been newly introduced. Some of them have been like the Barmer choke. The limit sort of has been in there for almost forever from a pilot. So, you know, who developed the pilot to start off with? And is it real? How much can we really deliver through the choke? How much we can't deliver through the choke? So some of these do need to be further tested and some real modelling done. Some more rigorous modelling under various different scenarios and various different weather scenarios as well, and wetness scenarios. So I think a centralised authority could help, but it's not the only way. I think there's other ways that we could do this with the existing regime, because there'd be a lot to do to unwind our current water resources from state-based control. I don't think it will happen in my lifetime.
Rachel, do you have any quick thoughts you'd like to add on the idea of a central authority? Would it make things easier for irrigators at all?
I'm just going to quickly jump back to the losses thing really quickly, if you don't mind. But so just on the losses, I think losses do need to be factored into trade, especially with trades downstream. However, I think that we're living with climate change. We're living with a drying climate, and I think the most important thing for us as a country is to try and maximise the amount of water that in the productive pool that's actually available for production. So if we start, the more we trade downstream, even if we do factor the losses into those trades, every time we do that, we minimise the amount of water that's available for productivity. So I think that's a really key factor. Jumping to a centralised authority on trade, I think there is so much work that needs to be done that's come out of the ACCC report in terms of improving the water market. I don't know if that's the priority. I think there's a whole heap of other things that we could tackle first before we look at doing that. And I guess if you were to look at doing that, you really need to establish what is the clear role of that authority. We have river operators operating the rivers for a clear purpose, because they're the experts at it and they know what's needed, and their role is to deliver water in the most efficient way possible. And I think I don't know if we're going to achieve a better result by centralising that those three operators into one at the moment. So that's I don't think that's our key priority.
There's a question here. It's got 7 thumbs up there. IVT restrictions were originally put in place to manage trade's impact on spill risk. This arises because of delivery of traded water happens after trade, potentially a very long time after. Does ABARES' proposal entail linking time of trade with time of delivery? What impact would this have for water users? Neil, you're probably best placed to look at that idea. Do you have something to add on that question?
Yeah, so it's becoming pretty relevant now that dams are very full and we're at risk of spilling again. So this kind of emerged out of when Victoria changed their carryover rules and we had the floods around 2011, 2012. This was kind of a big concern about both carryover water spilling and also IVT water. So, you know, if you're in the Goulburn, for example, and they've committed to trade water out, but they haven't delivered it yet, and there could be up to 200 gigalitres sitting in a dam, then who wears that loss if that 200 gigalitres spills while it's waiting to be kind of sent out? So I guess, yeah, the idea that we're putting forward kind of moves away from this idea that you have to accumulate large volumes of trade and then gradually drip feed them out over long periods of time. You're moving more to a more kind of real-time approach to trade, where each month the volumes that are moving are pretty close to the actual trades. So you're not accumulating this big IVT debt that you're then sitting in the dam at risk of spilling. So that's one of the other advantages of it.
Just on the back of that then, can we go to Mihir's talk? Actually made the point about trying to define, and the incredibly difficult thing to do is to define the right amount of water for trade as well. Can you sort of talk to the idea, Neil, of the trade-off between the demand for water from irrigators' perspective and brokers' perspective and a lot of the business around it, but also that of a river operator's perspective as well?
Yeah, so I guess like we were talking about with Tom's perspective before, from an individual farmer's perspective or an individual broker, that they're always going to be looking for the maximum trade capacity that they can get in order to kind of maximise the value of water to them. But you've got to think about the third-party effects and the fact that when one individual person trades water, that can contribute to losses. It can also have implications for the environment. And these things are really complicated. So I think that the system that we have at the moment, we're kind of arriving on the volume of trade almost by accident. So the market uses trade water without thinking about or worrying about what losses they're causing or what environmental consequences might happen. And the river operators are trying to deliver that trade as it accumulates without really having the ability to set how much trade can be allowed. So this is essentially the core of what we're talking about, is that we need an entity to kind of make those difficult trade-offs and to balance up the benefits of trade, the economic benefits that accrue to water users, with the environmental and the system operation issues.
I'm conscious of time and we're fast coming to the end of our hour. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface and we're talking about Intervalley trade. We need another 3 hours on this session. But before I go, I'd love to get some final thoughts from you all on sort of where things stand or something that we've picked up on that you would like our audience to think about when they're considering water market or water market reform for the year ahead. So, Joe, do you mind if I go to you first on this? Is there any part of your work or even one of our recent answers that you'd like to elaborate on or make sure people keep an eye out on in the future?
Look, I think just to loop back to the start, so as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work on the Goulburn to Murray Trade Review, and I think some of the core questions we're asking, and there's many ways you can ask it, exactly this one of how much trade is possible within those limits of the environment and potentially impact on others. So it's coming at this question from one particular way. One of the key things I'd add is, I think what we've learned along the way is there's a fair bit of complexity and trade-off in that. So the amount, for example, we've done a lot of work in Victoria understanding the environmental risks on the Goulburn, and the answer is not linear. It doesn't say in this month you can take this much and this month to next month. It says on balance, looking at likely this much in this pattern over the course of time with some variability. Is it high risk? Is it a bit lower? Those kind of things. So I think to me, that's one of the big lessons for us in going through this process, that there's a lot of complexity that goes into it. We would like people to, I guess, be engaged and start to understand how we're thinking about that complexity, because I think the questions we're asking today are the really important ones for the long term. As Mihir said at the start, trade and intervalley trade is a really fundamental part of our system. And we've asked many questions today, but one of the key ones is, how do we have confidence that we're creating the right amount of trade and thinking about the right amount of things in limiting trade? We're having a go at one way at it. There's plenty of other dimensions you could layer on, as today's discussion is. And I think we will be, as per the ACCC roadmap, for the next few years, because really what the ACCC roadmap does is identifies some common issues and says governments should sit down and talk about these collectively, how to best integrate that into their thinking. So again, sorry, Warwick, that's a bit of a ramble, but I'd encourage people to get engaged, because I think there are a lot of people online and interested, and I think we're asking these questions through a number of forums, and it's important we're talking about them.
Tom, can I bring you in with your final thoughts, observations, something to look out for?
Yeah, look, I'd reinforce Joe's comments. And for instance, why should people care to want to be engaged? And let me give you a little reason, or let me give, for instance, a section of the market a little reason. If you're a water right holder in the Goulburn Murray district, like in the central Goulburn district, for instance, there is 3.4 billion reasons why you should be interested in IVTs. Because prior to 2012, we had value parity of Murray and Goulburn water right values. And what's occurred now is post-IVT, post-2012, we've actually seen Murray and Goulburn separate in their values. And the value difference now, if you're in the Goulburn versus in the Murray, is you've lost $3.4 billion of value in your water rights. And so we need to be really careful about what we ask for. Do we want extra protection and the ability for us to control water not leaving our district? Well, you could do that, but it might cost you $3 billion. And so this is $3 billion less money that people can access through their banks to run their farms, for their retirements, all sorts of things. That's a lot of money in one district. So I think this is an issue, a really important issue. And this is why I'm pro expanding trade, because I know expanding trade means better value for your water rights. And better value for the water rights means that I'm protecting our clients' asset values and their farm asset values, because that's what they want to do. They want to increase their farm asset values. So get involved with this. It is an important debate, so I'm talking here not about the value of the temporary water difference. I'm talking about the perennial value of the water right itself. And we understand that these IVTs can have a big impact on that. So we do need to be involved and as water right holders, and I do encourage you to do that. It has been mentioned a couple of little times, environment, etc. There's a variety of different IVTs. New South Wales and Vic is one. The choke, Vic to Vic, New South Wales to New South Wales, the border rivers in Queensland and New South Wales. There's a variety of these different areas. So it's a complex beast. And thank you for your time. Thank you for the Minister's time. And thank you, Mihir, for your time as well in your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tom. And Rachel, I feel like you're the perfect place to finish with the irrigator perspective. There's so much, as Tom was just saying, of your bank balance relies on this, but also you're the people sort of using it, water every day and planning for it every other day, I'd imagine too. So tell us your perspective. What are you watching for the next year ahead, and where would you like to see change?
Okay, Warwick, I'll try and be really quick because I'm cognizant of the time. But I think going off Tom's point that while yes, there's potentially opportunity to expand trade, we've got to be really careful about the third-party impacts. And those people in the tributaries are currently paying for the losses that are associated with delivering that water downstream, and they're collectively paying for it. It's not just the person doing the trade. So we've got to be clear about what the losses are before we increase the volume of losses. We need to be careful of the environment. We've done all this work over the past 2-3 decades to protect our environments and our river systems. We need to make sure we continue to promote good environments and not degrade those further. We need a system of IVT trade that's simple and user-friendly and that we can have confidence in. Whatever we do, we don't want to go backwards in that space. We want to go forwards. And I think in terms of what's driving river operators' decisions, we need to make sure they try and operate those rivers as efficiently as possible, because we live in a very arid place. Climate change says our water availability is getting smaller, not greater. So we need to make sure we try and keep as much water available for productivity as is possible.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much, Joe Banks, Neil Hughes, Tom Rooney, Mihir Gupta, you heard from earlier, as well as the Water Minister, Federal Water Minister Keith Pitt. Thank you to joining us and sticking with us slightly over time on the ABARES panel here on water as well. It's been great to get in depth, even though I've only feel like we've scratched the surface. Hopefully we'll get to talk water again next year.